Hi, Magnify. It's Brooke Walker. I'm excited for this conversation because I think it will serve as a reminder to be more gentle with ourselves as we are letting the Savior mold us into who we need to be, that we don't need to be in a rush to become better immediately, but that we can rest and find some calmness, knowing we are a work in progress. In fact, today's guest calls it the slow work of God. I'm here with Rachel Cope. Rachel experienced a devastating medical crisis that has resulted in ongoing health struggles, but it was when she learned that there wouldn't be an immediate answer to her challenges that she learned we can carve out meaning and allow the time to work in us. Rachel teaches church history and doctrine at BYU. She holds a PhD in American history with an emphasis in women's history and religious history. That's a lot of history. Rachel, you're a smart gal. Thank you for being here on Magnify with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Did you always have an affinity for stories of the past?
I did. I was always a big reader and always a lover of historical things. So it was something my mom fostered within me.
Did she always pushing that type of literature or conversation, or how did she do that?
Yeah, she was an English literature major.
Oh, there it is.
So she's from England. And so she just was always talking about history and culture and literature and exposed me to a lot of things from an early age.
Was she talking in an accent?
She does have an accent.
Oh, even more lovely, even more lovely. Well, I am so eager to dive into the pages of your book and even more so the in-between lessons and applications that went into your writing. It's a beautiful book, just came out. Congratulations. Very new. That's a big project. You've studied out how God's work is a slow work. And I love the word gracious too, a gracious work where we can allow ourselves time to really be patient, right? And let God in. And you learned this when a medical mistake was made while receiving a hysterectomy, which led to ongoing health struggles. You've shared your story before, I know, and I have a feeling it will be woven into the stories that we hear today. But to start us off, Rachel, I'd love to know what you mean, how you define it when you say, I was God's slow work. That's not a phrase we hear often, slow work.
Yeah. I initially encountered that phrase in a poem written by a Jesuit priest, and a friend and I shared that back and forth. So the phrase itself came from that. But in terms of reflecting upon it and kind of realizing that I was God's slow work in the way that I did, it stems from a few things. One is just in Moses, we learned that God's work and glory is the eternal life of his children. God's work is us, right? We are God's work. Humanity is God's work. And that his goal is our conversion. And conversion is far more than believing in God or going to church or fulfilling your callings. Conversion is changing your nature. It's becoming somebody different. It's taking the experiences that we have in life and allowing them to transform us and to make us better than we were, to become more Christ-like. Having this major medical crisis resulted in a period of time where my life didn't just slow down. It kind of came to a complete halt. Everything that I had been doing was no longer possible. Just to briefly summarize, during my hysterectomy, there were some internal injuries that occurred that we weren't aware of. And it took some time afterwards to be able to actually identify and diagnose those injuries. But because of the nature of the injuries that had affected my bladder, it led to necrosis, which is basically tissue dissolving or breaking down. And that necrosis formed a vesicovaginal fistula, which is a hole between the bladder and the vaginal canal. And that means that urine pours from your bladder into your vaginal canal 24/7. And so you have urine leaking out of your vaginal canal all the time, which is not where urine is supposed to be. And so it's just a very traumatic and life-altering experience. So because of that, I had to have additional surgical repairs. That failed as well. So I ended up having to travel from Utah to Alabama during COVID to have surgery because there was an expert there who was able to perform complicated surgeries like that. It's not an ailment that is very common in the United States. It tends to affect people in Asia and Africa who live in poverty and circumstances where they don't have access to medical care. The amount of time between the hysterectomy and the fistula repair working was 1 day short of a year. And so I was suffering with the vesicovaginal fistula for a full year. And then recovery from that was extremely difficult and slow and complicated. So that slow time period of recovering from that surgery gave me an opportunity to reflect upon what the slow work of God really means and to start looking at things as a person and also as a historian through a very different lens. I started to see stories in different ways and people in different ways and just recognize things that I think I probably missed before.
I find myself thinking how timely your book and your message and ultimately your testimony is, in the sense that we all know how, I don't even need to say how fast-paced our society is, but it's also sort of this natural man characteristic, right? Where we want that instant application or that instant relief. Society, I think, is only enhancing, that tap our toes sort of impatience. But these are hard lessons that, and you've paid a hard price for them, I know. So I'm very grateful, and I don't take that lightly as we dive into some of these lessons today. I talked about your passion for history, and you have reached to some historical women, names we know, some we don't, to help illustrate these lessons. And I'd love to hear about some of the women you've studied and how they're examples of letting God work in them and mold them over a lifetime impacted you. I love the lens you put on Lucy Mack Smith, mother of Joseph Smith. And many of us, I think, might not know that Lucy Mack's story was actually very similar to her son's when it comes to her spiritual discovery. From a really young age, Lucy also wanted to know more about spiritual matters. She lost 2 sisters in her teen years, and that caused her to really deeply consider and contemplate how she might align herself more closely with God after a loss like that. Throughout her early married life, she lost children. She became physically ill herself, and she continued to feel, much like Joseph, this internal conflict about which church to join. Eventually, and this is the part that I think mothers in particular will love to reflect on, but she too knelt in a forested area to pray. And she later had a dream that she took as a sign she would find spiritual peace one day. And then 20 years later, that's not a quick fast forward, that is a long 20 years later, Joseph took to the sacred grove. Talk to me about that 20 years, Rachel. That time span is poignant to you.
Yeah, it really struck me years ago when I was working on an academic paper about Lucy Mack Smith and putting her in context with some of her contemporary Protestant women and looking at conversion experiences that they had. And then I read in Lucy's own account the idea of 20 years, and it just struck me so powerfully. And I think partly because I'm a perfectionist, and I was someone who always wanted to do things quick, and I would beat myself up when I would struggle or when things bothered me or I didn't feel like I worked through things fast enough. And reading that was just so comforting to me because it made me realize, like, this took her 20 years. The prayer didn't just come in an instant, here's what you've been asking for. It took, I was going to say a lifetime, but it is true, even past the 20 years. It took a lifetime of searching and seeking and rethinking and asking questions and then getting answers and asking new questions and just constantly discovering new things. And even when we have an answer to prayer or a revelatory experience that confirms something to us or provides us with an answer, I think it still takes a lot of time before we actually fully understand what that means, the full impact, the full significance of it. So we can think we have an answer to our prayer, and then 20 years later, we realize, oh, there's a lot more nuance to that, and that prayer still being answered, or there are different layers to that prayer that have been added onto it over time. And I really see that in Lucy's account, where she waited for 20 years praying the same prayer. There were little pieces of answers along the way, but she didn't receive the answer to the question that she was really asking for a long time. But even when she received the answer, it wasn't over. She still had a lot of learning and growth and change to do, and her understanding of the gospel would transform dramatically even after that.
The answer just took her to the next square on the board.
Yeah.
And as you described that time, I found myself, the word that popped in my mind was actually, that's a lot of suffering. And that might sound dramatic. That's a lot of discomfort, though, to sit with a question for that long. And like you said, there's little crumbs, I think, that as we look back, we're able to say, oh, that was part of it and that was part of it. But it doesn't always feel good to sit in that space. And I'm curious what your answer would be to this question, because I found myself thinking, what then differentiates a slow God from a non-existent or a distant God? Because I'm telling you, after 20 years, I might start to wonder a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a great question. And I think for Lucy, if we're looking at it through Lucy's perspective for a minute, I think for Lucy, she didn't feel like God wasn't with her during that time. She felt God's presence. She felt God's love. She felt a connection to God. She felt answers to prayers. She just didn't sense the final answer, right? Or yeah, we'll call it the final answer. She didn't sense that final answer, but even her dream was promising her of things to come, right? So she had this sense that there was going to be more. It's not yet. And I think if we really look at our experiences, if we really look at our struggles, we can see those same kinds of experiences where it may feel like God isn't present, or, that there was this blank space where I'm not getting an answer. I don't see this, but we can look back and see preparatory moments or little glimpses and insights that are preparing us for things to come, that are helping us understand things, that are changing us and helping us grow.
And if I could assert a little, I sort of hear you saying, while we might be waiting on answers for God, we don't have to wait on God. He can still be there along the way. It reminds me of a quote from the recent release, An I Single. It's a compilation of Patricia Holland's testimonies and teachings and wisdom. And one thing she said in that book, she said, everything I've done that's been a challenge has driven me closer and closer to the Lord. Everything, period. That during those hard times, and I appreciate you framing it through Lucy Mack Smith's lens as well, during those hard times, even though we are, quote, waiting on the Lord, he's right there still. It's not like there's a distance or a separation during that waiting period.
And I actually do think, even though, again, in the moment, it may not feel that way.
Yeah.
I really do think that it is in the hardest times that we feel God's presence strongest, even if it takes hindsight to look back and see that. It just made me think of a story. So there was an American woman who works in London who ended up with a vesicovaginal fistula from a hysterectomy. Her situation wasn't as complicated as mine, but it was still awful. But she, a man named Lewis Wall, who founded the Worldwide Fistula Fund, put us in contact with each other. And it was about a year after my fistula repair. So it was still pretty raw and real. And I was still going through a lot physically at that time. We were able to communicate through her surgical experiences, and she was able to ask me questions. She'd even send me pictures and be like, does this look normal? What should I be doing about this? We just had a really beautiful friendship and relationship that developed around that. And we're able to support one another in a circumstance that most people just don't understand. But one of the things that really struck me one day, because she's an atheist, she doesn't believe in God. And it just really hit me that she didn't believe in God, but God was with her. And God had put me into her life to help her through a really difficult experience and to provide that support and love that she needed. And so even though she wouldn't have identified that as God's love and grace and help in her life, it was. And I felt that deeply and spiritually, that God was answering the prayers she didn't even know to pray through me. And it also ended up being a blessing to me because there was someone that I could talk to about my own experiences. And we were able to kind of heal together in some ways and to have this beautiful friendship develop. And I was able to meet her in person last summer, and we've stayed friends and stayed in touch. And that's a lifelong friendship that is very different than any other friendship I have because of that unique story that we share.
That binds you. I bet that was a really sweet hello hug.
Yes.
When you met her for the first time. Let's go to this next woman, drawn from the pages of, again, your book, Nancy Lamson Holbrook. Nancy, I'll just summarize her story really briefly. Nancy was skeptical when it was her husband that first investigated the church, but she ended up being baptized after feeling what she describes as that true conversion. She was part of the few women who were in Zion's camp, which was filled with a lot of trial of faith. And then when she returned to Missouri after the failed 800-mile trek, she immediately caught cholera while also taking care of her 3 young children. The story doesn't stop there, though. Her home was burned down by a mob. She had to flee to Nauvoo. And at that point, she had little left to give. She died in Nauvoo after contracting cholera again. This story seems really tragic, But I do appreciate what you wrote. You said, there is, of course, deep beauty in the fact that God can and does sanctify the inevitable losses and suffering that are threaded into mortal life. As Nancy's story demonstrates, her losses did change her heart and change her mind. The gospel message she had once viewed with skepticism had worked its way into the fabric of her life. She believed implicitly. She trusted when consumed by tragedy. She demonstrated the endurance needed to engage in true spiritual conversion, a slow process that often emerges in unexpected forms. Through her difficult journey, she had the patience to acquire a Zion-like heart. The gift of redemption transformed her affliction into conversion. How does Nancy's story, Rachel, teach you that we can find joy in the gospel in every circumstance, not just the happy, pleasant ones?
I think one of the first things that is important to recognize, and I think it does come out in Nancy's story and really in all of the stories in the book, is that happiness is not about having an ideal life. It's not even about circumstances. Yes, circumstances can make you happy and things can make you feel happy, but true happiness is a state of being, and it's really tied to, I think, emotional and spiritual contentment. It comes from your relationship with God, your relationship with others, and your relationship with yourself. And it seems that through the trials and the suffering and the things that she had faced, she found a way to find peace within. And that does not in any way take away from the suffering that she went through. And I don't think that we should dismiss or downplay anybody's suffering. And that we also need to make space for people to have bad days and to be frustrated and overwhelmed and to think that they can't do it. And I guarantee she felt that way, as has every human. Right. And that's not being faithless. That's not being a bad person. That's not losing your relationship with God or anything like that. It's just part of struggle, a part of suffering, a part of loss. But there was something internal that was stronger than the physical ailments that she had, than the physical suffering that she was facing, that gave her a strength and a capacity that exceeded the limitations in her life, I guess you could say. And I think that that's something that we're all striving for and something that we can attain, that even when circumstances are miserable or painful or difficult, we can have, even if it's just moments, peace and joy and contentment, and to be able to find and recognize your relationship with God and to value the relationships that you have with other people, to have a real sense of community and belonging, and to realize that life is more than right now. And in the right now, when you're suffering and things are bad, that's really hard to recognize sometimes. But there is more than what you're experiencing in that moment. And when we have that eternal perspective, it can really help us endure things well and look through a more cheerful lens, I guess, and to feel happier, even though the circumstances do not make it seem like happiness should be an option.
Amen. Amen, sister. You articulated that so well, and your words beautifully complemented that of our prophet, right? President Nelson has told us joy in the journey, peace in the circumstance. And I do think the word peace is a good one to maybe apply this thought to, but sometimes I think we underestimate the promise, meaning peace feels sometimes too simple or too calm or even expected. But when you consider just the conflict and contrast that is life, peace is a miracle. To be able to feel peace in those circumstances you described, in Nancy's circumstances, in Lucy Mack Smith's circumstances, that is a miracle.
It is. Going back to some of the things I said earlier, peace often comes in the most unlikely circumstances when we're really suffering. I think we get an extra dose of peace sometimes when things are most difficult. I remember before my surgery, my head felt a little overwhelmed and like, if this fails again, what happens to my life? But I felt so peaceful and was so calm, abnormally calm. Like I was kind of like, this is not like me. I'm much more anxious than this by nature. But I just felt this deep sense of peace, and you're not alone, and things are going to be okay. And it was just so comforting and a peace beyond description.
I came into this conversation very much wanting to ask you also about endurance, and maybe this is a good time to do it as we reflect on Nancy Holbrook's story. But what have you come to learn about endurance, Rachel, as it relates to your relationship with God?
Endurance, I think, I'm going to borrow a term from Soren Kierkegaard, a philosopher. I think it's a laborious process, and this ties in with conversion too. And I'm going to share a quote. And he's talking about conversion, but maybe in a different way than we typically think of conversion.
Okay.
And I think it ties in very well with the idea of endurance, that how much work it takes to not just to convert, but to endure through that conversion process. So here's the quote. Oh, turn around, which I just love that too, because turning is converting, right? Turn around from where you are. I'm going to keep interjecting. Sorry.
I love it.
Come here. Do not shrink from the difficulty of retreat, no matter how hard it is. Do not be afraid of the laborious pace of conversion, right? Which is not how we think of conversion, right? We might say, oh, it's long, it's slow, but we don't refer to it as a laborious pace. But it's a laborious pace, and that requires endurance.
Yeah, I would interject and say we think of it as ongoing. We accept it as ongoing, but we don't reference or refer to it or accept it as laborious.
Exactly. He continues, however toilsomely it leads to salvation. Another word that we don't typically associate.
There's a word I need in my life. Say it again.
Toilsomely. So conversion requires endurance, and it's laborious and toilsome. Whereas sin leads onward with winged speed, with mounting haste, or leads downward so easily, so indescribably easy, indeed as easily as when the horse, completely relieved of pulling, cannot, not even with all its strength, stop the wagon, which runs it into the abyss. Then do not despair over every relapse. So conversion is also not a straightforward path that we just get on and continue to the end and get it all right. Right? You're going to relapse. You're going to mess up. You're going to sin. You're going to be lazy. You're going to forget. You're going to be frustrated. So do not despair over every relapse, which the God of patience has the patience to forgive, and under which a sinner certainly should have the patience to humble himself. Right? So the relapses will be forgiven by God as we humble ourselves. No, fear nothing and do not despair. He who says, come here, is with you on the way. From him there is help and forgiveness on the way of conversion that leads to him, and with him is rest. So mortal life is, we're laboriously engaged in a conversion process, and we're going to struggle, and we're going to fail, and we're going to relapse, and it's going to require great endurance and commitment and hard work to be able to fully be converted, to be fully transformed, and to become the person that we aspire to be, to become Christ-like.
And hang on and dig deep, because short of saying sin is fun, that's not the message. But when it talked about the speed of sin, that sometimes I can make bad choices and it's not going to land as heavy as the good choices sometimes that push me to the next level.
Exactly. There are several moments, including Liberty Jail, which is a chapter in the book looks at that as well, where Joseph Smith and others, of course, are kind of asking those questions like, why does it feel like the people who are doing the wrong things, like everything's just falling into place, life is good, they're happy, they're having a good time, they're not suffering, and I'm trying to do the right thing and things are falling apart, we're being persecuted. Feels like God should be reaching out and helping us and protecting us and making the bad guys go away and the good guys win, to put it into kind of little kid phrases, right? But instead it feels like the opposite. It feels like the easiness is coming in with the wrong decisions, and the difficulty is coming with the right decisions. And that's accurate.
So then what's the reward? What's the incentive? If that's the truth, then what?
The reward is that, to quote the Book of Mormon, wickedness never was happiness. The choices that we make that do pull us away from God, that provide instant gratification, actually don't have lasting power. There may be consequences that come with them, but they don't bring joy. And there's a heaviness that comes with them eventually that results in burdens that people have to carry and is a struggle. Whereas drawing closer to God and engaging in the conversion process and enduring through hard things, if we do it with an eye single to God, it results in compassion and empathy and love and patience and forgiveness and gentleness and kindness, traits that reflect Christ-like living.
Let's talk about another woman in your book, Frida McGee Below. She joined the church when she was a young girl living in New Orleans. The ban for Black people to hold the priesthood and partake in temple activity, it was a challenge, as you might imagine, to her as a Black woman. But the gospel message always resonated with her. She suffered her early adult life in a marriage that was abusive, that resulted in a divorce that was messy. She didn't feel well. She was ill. She had to move back in with her parents. That strip of independence can be so hard. Many other struggles also that Black people faced during the 20th century also faced Frida. At times you described her as a congregation of one, but she always found ways to worship on her own, which I paused and revered at that. That's special to dig in and have you be the only witness to your worship. But she did that when she was 82 years old. She finally received her temple endowment and was sealed posthumously to her second husband who had joined the church. So you wrote this about Frida, Rachel. You wrote, Frida chose to let her daily challenges make her stronger. She opted to become converted rather than embittered. This does not mean she never felt frustrated, hurt, or angry. It means that she chose to receive grace in the context of loss. That is such a beautiful passage. Grace in the context of loss. She chose to let the slow work of God transform her heart. She chose to consecrate her challenges and unjust circumstances to the Lord so she could draw closer to the divine. How has your view, Rachel, on consecration? We don't talk about that word very often in our modern way, but how has that changed as you've learned more about stories like Frida's?
I think so often when people hear the term consecration, they either think of kind of having everything in common or really focus on the financial, economic side of consecration, right? It's giving stuff and stuff that costs money. And that is such a small part of what it means to consecrate. Right? To consecrate is to give of yourself, and it's to give it willingly, and it's to give in such a way that you yourself are becoming holy or sanctified or transforming and changing, because that process of giving willingly, of loving God and loving people with all of your heart means that you're changing, that you're converting, right? That you are becoming a different kind of person. And maybe your initial reason for doing those things is trying to do the right thing, but eventually you're doing them because that's who you are, right? And that's part of what conversion is. Maybe we're living the gospel trying to do the right things, or because we think that we might be happier if we do it, or somebody wants us to do it. And conversion, and we know conversion is taking place when we realize that we're doing it because that's who we are and what we want to do. And we don't even think about doing it in another way because this is the way that is meaningful to us and that is our character. Anyway, so these stories like Frida's, I think are a beautiful reflection of that. And maybe the best examples that we have of consecration, because Frida's not even invited to sit at the table, really. Being excluded is something that shapes and defines her spiritual life. But she sees God through all of that. And her focus is not on the people around her and the choices that they make, because people around us are always going to disappoint us. But she's really focused on Christ and on the principles of the gospel that are meaningful to her. And she continues to be committed and to engage in her own conversion process and to live the principles and to transform and change through that. And that is what consecration is. She's giving everything she has to give. And it looks different and is different than what others have to give. But maybe we could call this the widow's mite. She's giving everything. She feels the something more that comes from commitment to God. And she's willing to sacrifice and give to those around her, even as they're excluding her.
Right. A lot to learn from her. That's Frida Below. I guess my final question as we wrap this has been so lovely, Rachel. Thank you. You have a hard-earned testimony that's inspiring us in all the right ways. But my final question might be, how did this mindset, or how does this mindset apply in the everyday? What does it do for you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Like how does this help you feel peace that God is molding you to who you need to be, and not that you have to rush to some metaphorical finish line?
Yeah, I think that makes me think of a couple of scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants that basically say the same thing. But one is in D&C 50, verses 40 and 41, where it says, "Behold, ye are little children, and ye cannot bear all things now. Ye must grow in grace and in the knowledge of the truth. Fear not, little children, for you are mine, and I have overcome the world, and you are of them that my Father hath given me." And then in D&C 78, verses 17 and 18, which interestingly is a section about consecration, it says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye are little children, and ye have not as yet understood how great blessings the Father hath in his own hands and prepared for you. And ye cannot bear all things now. Nevertheless, be of good cheer, for I will lead you along. The kingdom is yours, and the blessings thereof are yours, and the riches of eternity are yours." And my favorite part of both of those scriptures is the part that says, "Ye are little children, and you can't understand all things now." And I think that that's a part of the gospel that we forget about all the time. Even when we're adults, we're little children in the gospel. And
Yes.
we receive things and we learn things and we study things and we talk about things and we think that we understand them and we don't. And that's what God's saying here to them. Like, you think you understand the things that I've just told you, but you don't get it. You don't understand it yet. And you need my guidance and my love and my grace and my support to grow into the things that you think you already understand, but really don't. And I think keeping that perspective is really crucial to our daily lives, of recognizing that we are just learning and we are not alone in that. God is with us. God is supporting us. God is guiding us. We're going to have things that we really, really flop at and things that we really succeed at. Show yourself some grace. See what you're doing right.
See what you're doing right. So instead of a to-do list, maybe it's a I got it list.
Yeah.
Rachel, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Magnify. We really hope you enjoyed it. We also would love to hear from you, so please go follow us on Instagram at Magnify Community, and be sure to be subscribed to our newsletter by heading to magnifythegood.com, where you can sign up, and there will be great ways for you to participate and send your feedback in. We have some really exciting things looking forward to this summer, so be sure to be following along both here and on Instagram, where you'll see some of those updates and announcements, including our book club, upcoming episodes, and fun ways to participate in the Magnify community. Please always be sure to be sharing your favorite episodes, commenting your favorite parts, and just being a part of our community. It means so much to us. We will have all the details in our show description for where you can follow us along or sign up for our newsletter, and for all the other details in our show. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next week.